Let's turn on to the two MacFarlanes. Now, that is Ronald Craig MacFarlane Sr., the father of Alexander and Robert Craig Jr. And there he is standing in front of the stoep at Röderberg. Now, he came out with his brother from England late in the 19th century. And his brother was suffering from TB. And they were told that it was necessary to go to a drier climate. So they started off in Uitenhage. And unfortunately, the brother's TB must have been too advanced, and he eventually died of TB there. And Robert Craig Sr. moved to Graaff-Reinet, and there he became the accountant for Walter Rubidge. And they had a very good relationship between them. Obviously, Walter Rubidge relied on him, and he relied on Walter Rubidge to sort of connect him to the community. And Robert Craig not only managed the business affairs of Walter Rubidge, but he also hired ground and bought cattle and fattened them up and sold them on. So he began to have a kind of double source of income. And when Walter Rubidge wanted to move from Röderberg, he then sold it to R.C. MacFarlane Sr. And so that is how they came to live on Röderberg. Now, he married a local girl, Jessie Wardlaw Reed, whose father owned the next door farm, Glendinning, and I think Glendinning was probably Brandkraal, or not.
The farm that's now called Careerstomp, and it's towards Aberdeen.
Towards Aberdeen, Careerstomp. Yeah, okay, so that I've got that wrong here, thank you. So anyway, and there are Wardlaw Reeds buried in St. James's Cemetery, not Jessie, but I don't know where she was buried. But they had the two boys, Alexander MacFarlane and Robert Craig Jr. And there was quite a difference in age between the two of them. The date he bought Röderberg was 1898, and Alexander MacFarlane was definitely adult before the First World War, because he was already a member of the Graaff-Reinet Club at that stage. Now, where they went to school, I'm not sure. It may have been the Graaff-Reinet College originally, I don't know. But then he got sent to Bishop's, and there, we'll show the picture later. His name is also on their roll of honor in memory of those who died in the First World War. He went to Bradfield College in England and then came back. Robert Craig was born much later. He must have been born about 1897, because he was only 17 when he died. But that's an even more dramatic story. When the war broke out, Alexander came back from Bradfield to Graaff-Reinet, and the idea must have been that he would continue farming with his father and after his father. He joined up, and he was part of the Graafrenet Commando that went with Smuts and Botha to Southwest Africa, and he became a captain in the Graafrenet Commando and an adjutant. Now, I couldn't find photographs of him for ages. I looked in the museum at pictures of officers in the Graafrenet Commando, but there weren't names under any of them. So, and then suddenly one popped up on the British Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So it's not as though they've just got a record of what happened to the person. They also seem to follow up on getting extra information. And so there is a, yes, that is the father, that's the cartoon in the Graafrenet Club of Robert Craig Sr. That is Alexander MacFarlane, very good-looking young man. And as I say, he was in the South African campaign, a captain, adjutant. Now, an adjutant is quite important because he does a lot of the organizing, or the carrying out of the orders of the colonel for the general organization of the regiment. But when the South African campaign was over, he was demobbed and presumably he went back to the farm. But then he decided to join up for the war in France. Maybe it was the death of his younger brother that caused him to do it. But when he joined up, he joined the Royal Field Artillery, and typical blooming Poms, despite the fact that he'd been a captain and an adjutant and had some live military experience, they made him, guess what, a second lieutenant, right at the bottom of the pile. You know, those colonials, they don't really know anything. To be called a bloody colonial was quite a frequent sort of superior comment by the snottier kind of Pom. So he joined up as a second lieutenant and was sent to the front and died in 1917. What was the Cambrai offensive? There were always offensives which never seemed, which I have no doubt offended the Germans, but they never seemed to get very far in the First World War on either side. And he died in one of the early tank attacks. Also typical of a certain English military mind, the general in charge of the attack was skeptical about tanks and machine guns. So the initial plan of a combined tank and infantry attack broke down and petered out. And there was a surprise German counterattack under cover of gas and smoke shells, and it was likely that Alexander died in this attack. And now there are huge gaps in the about this time in the Graafrenet advertisers in the Graafrenet Museum, and also the copies of the Graafrenet advertiser in the South African National Library archives. So he died, but the advertiser said, most popular with all who had the honor of his acquaintance, he has now gone west, a unit of that glorious and innumerable company who have made the great sacrifice that future generations may live in peace and quietude free from the tyranny from the oppressor, the menace of militarism which sought to dominate the world. Well, it was rightly and wrongly an era of great patriotism, and I'm afraid the hopes that people had after the First World War proved to be very ephemeral, because along came the Second World War. Now, in a way, the saddest of them all was the younger brother. Could we? That is, yes, that is the Bishop's War Memorial. If one would have to go and stand very close to it to be able to see Alexander MacFarlane's name on it. The next one, please. And that is the plaque in the club. John has something very interesting, and I'm sure he'll be speaking about it in due course, on Andrew Haldane Murray. And the other one, I don't know if anybody knows about him, Peter Storm Ross. So, young Alexander Craig. Now, Jesse Wardlaw MacFarlane, née Reed, died sadly young. And so Robert Craig was sort of left without a mother, and there are kind of implications that he was a bit of a tearaway, that he was a bit difficult. And obviously also they needed a career for him, so he was sent off to join the Royal Navy as an officer, and he went to Dartmouth in Devon to train as such. And he was still at Dartmouth when the war broke out in 1914. And of course then a whole lot of ships, particularly rather out-of-date ships, were pressed into service, and that required that they be manned. And so I suspect that a lot of the midshipmen who hadn't quite got to the end of their training were posted fairly early to ships, and he was posted to a ship called HMS Hawke. And the job of HMS Hawke and HMS Theseus, which was a cruiser of similar age to HMS Hawke, their job was to patrol the North Sea between the Shetland Islands and Norway to pick up any information as to whether the Germans were trying to get round the north of Britain in some kind of way. And at some stage, HMS Theseus and HMS Hawke were widely separated, and there was HMS Theseus had been attacked by a U-boat. They were called U-boats in the First World War as well, and it failed. But when they were separated, the captain of the U-boat picked on HMS Hawke, and the torpedo struck the middle of the ship and penetrated into the boiler room, causing the boilers to explode and setting the ship on fire. There wasn't much time to lower the lifeboats, which in any case the hoisting mechanism for the lifeboats was steam driven, and the boilers had been blown up. And only a small boat and some life rafts reached the water, and HMS Hawke sank within 10 minutes. So you can imagine there were an awful lot of people who were standing to their stations, but that would have meant that there were also a lot of people who were inside the ship at their various stations. And in the end, what they tried to do, the boat saw the periscope of the submarine sticking out above the water, and they rowed like mad to try and collide with the telescope, with the the scope, and destroy it. But the U-boat worked out what they were trying to do and sank itself a bit deeper. And in the end, the Norwegian trawler came. Now, there seem to be differences in the number of people who survived. 49 in one place it says, in another it says about 70. But when you consider that a ship of that size probably had a crew of about 700, and Robert Craig was one of the ones who didn't survive. So, yes, to die at 17, pretty awful. Pretty awful for the family, particularly. And they were never quite sure as to where HMS Hawke had sunk. Somewhere in the North Sea, somewhere roughly round about Aberdeen on the east coast of Scotland, and that was it. But history has a funny way of coming back to us. In August last year, some divers found the remains of HMS Hawke. It was a little bit higher up than Aberdeen. I don't know if you know how Scotland sort of comes zigzag on the North Sea coast. Well, it was there off the end of the first zigzag, as it were. But what also struck me, surprisingly deep for the North Sea, it was 70 miles east of Fraserburgh, and it was about 360 feet, 110 meters below the surface. And apparently it's in very good condition. It took quite a long time. It took them months and months to pinpoint that it was actually HMS Hawke, which they thought it was. But the thing that really determined that it was HMS Hawke was they managed to get hold of the logbook of the U-boat commander in the German naval records. And they were able to from what he said, his sort of description of where he'd done it, that it must have been HMS Hawke. And apparently it's very well preserved. The teak decks, the teak is still there, sort of almost undamaged. And when they looked through the portholes, they could see ship's china and things from the mess lying on the floor of the mess through the portholes. And of course that ship instantly becomes a war grave. So people can't legally go down and take things from it. It has to be left where it is, as it is. And that is the situation. Now, could we move on? That is HMS Hawke. If you look, it's got things that were, even by the First World War, were very old-fashioned. Those kind of guns on bay windows, as it were, to the side. And then there should be a picture, which I hope is the next one, of that is a photograph of the wreck. It's very murky, so although it makes no difference to the situation, I think it must be quite nice to know all about that. After Jessie Wardlaw Reid died, Mr. MacFarlane went back to England for some time, when I say some time, 6 months or a year, and Alexander ran the farm, and he remarried a concert pianist. I think she took quite a lot of strain in the Karoo. Maybe Ronald Craig Jr. didn't get on too well with, his stepmother. One doesn't know. But the amusing part is that the family were instructed that they were not to have any white chickens because they left their feathers on the stoep and on the lawn and made it look an awful mess. So I'm not quite sure what kind of hens they they ended up having. And then later on, the MacFarlane sold to the Holmeses and Sally, and then it got sold on to Rob's dad, and then there was a whole follow round at Dalham as well, from Rubidge to Holmes to. Could we just go on to the next one? I think yes. Now, actually, the MacFarlanes are on an awful lot of war memorials. They're on the war memorial here. I tried to take a picture of it the other day, but less said about going to take that picture, the better. So there's the memorial in the church. There's the memorial in the club to Alexander MacFarlane. If you just move on to the next one, there you can see that the loving memory of Marion Clark, wife of Alexander MacFarlane of Thornhill, Falkirk. So that must have been the father, I think, of Robert Craig Sr. And she died in 1917, but the family put the names of the two grandsons who died in the war there. Robert Craig comes first, so probably they put him in after the loss of HMS Hawke, and Alexander later. Oh no, he is there first, yes, Alexander MacFarlane, Royal Field Artillery. And Alexander MacFarlane's, the war cemetery he's buried in is about 20 or 30 kilometers away from Delville Wood.
And where is this? Where is this memorial?
This memorial is at Chislehurst, which is kind of an outlying suburb of London. And Robert Craig is also, I didn't produce a photo of it because it would have been too many war memorials, as it were. He's also on the National Royal Naval War Memorial at Chatham, which is, you can imagine, with the number of people who died in the Navy in 2 world wars, is absolutely huge. Thank you very much.